Tucson to take a position at the University of Arizona, where he is a professor of political science, specializing in international politics, democratic processes, and domestic public policy. He served for 20 years as the executive director of the International Studies Association, which is the largest association of its kind, focusing on international politics with a membership of over 7,000 scholars from 110 countries. He is also a co-owner of a firm here in Tucson that does business in the United States and overseas, involving business consultation, political consultation, and international trade. He served in public office from 1977 through 1991 as a member of the City of Tucson Council and then Mayor of Tucson. As a productive scholar, Dr. Volgy has published over 60 articles in professional journals and is the author and co-author of several books, including Shocks and Political Change, a comparative perspectives on foreign policy analysis, Turmoil and Order in Regional International Politics, Regions, Power and Conflict, Extreme Capabilities, Hierarchy and Rivalry, Major Powers and Quest for Status in International Politics, Mapping the New World Order, International Politics and the State Strength, Politics, Entrenched, Citizens, Politicians, and the Fate of Democracy. Also, he published in the format of so many articles. He has been honored by the University of Arizona with awards for a distinctive career in teaching and also as a distinguished public servant. Dr. Volgy ran successfully for local office, both on the Tucson City Council and as mayor of Tucson, and served for 14 years in elected office. During this time, he accepted as well a national leadership role in the United States Conference of Mayors and the National League of Cities, and was invited on numerous occasions to testify before the U.S. House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate and the National Governors Council on key urban policy issues facing the nation. He has also served as a delegate to 2 national democratic conventions, including his role on the DNC's Rules Committee. After leaving public office, Dr. Volgy has been actively involved throughout the United States government with the training of government officials overseas in the areas of democratic political development and public policy. He has conducted such a training in so many countries, including Kazakhstan, Russia, Ukraine, Estonia, Hungary, and Romania, among others. In addition, he was part of the international team that monitored Hungary's first democratic elections in the post-Cold War environment. He also served as a member of the U.S. State Department delegation to the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe Conference in Prague, and has lectured on international politics and transatlantic relations for the State Department in Europe. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Volgy for today's talk.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the kind introduction. The introduction is better than the presentation, I'm afraid. When you start to do public speaking, one of the first things people tell you is never to start with an apology. So I want to start with 3 apologies. Makes me look weaker, makes you more aggressive, but I need to do all 3 of them. One is that I am not a Middle East scholar. In fact, my guess is that you all probably know, every one of you, more about the Middle East than I do. So I'm sort of an interloper here. But what we've tried to do is to create a comparative regional perspective in terms of looking at the Middle East. And our empirical data that we're regenerating is based on a comparative perspective on Middle East, East Asia, and a number of other regions. Secondly, I must confess to you that we are probably 3 months early in being here making this presentation. We've just finished our coding project. We haven't really done much of our analysis, and we've only been descriptively looking at the data. By the way, when I say we, I don't mean that in the royal sense of we. I have 2 collaborators in crime sitting here with me, Celine and Sevi, and our 3rd one is at a medical appointment. So we've been doing this as a group. I will take responsibility for all the mistakes. These guys are responsible for all the good stuff that's been happening. And then finally, my 3rd apology. For those of you who are basketball fans, it's starting in an hour and a half. I promise you I will be done way in advance. And for those of you who need to go through rituals before our basketball game, we have plenty of time to do that. So this is our Regional Diplomatic Events Database project, and I want to give you some background about how we got here. This has been the puzzle that has been entertaining us for about 7 or 8 years. Why is it that some regions in the international political system are consistently conflictual? Others have moved from levels of very high conflict to relatively low conflict. Some regions have moved back and forth, and there are some regions that are consistently Pacific. It's a tough question to ask. It requires comparative regional analysis. But we know a couple of things that are very true. One is that there's very substantial variation across regions in terms of how conflictual they are. This is just one measure of interstate conflicts superimposed on regions. These are measures of what political scientists call MIDS, military interstate disputes of high severity, when two countries go at each other using coercive instruments. And this is a snapshot of how these regions, these are not all the regions in international politics, but how some of these regions look in the post-Cold War era. As you can tell, this is the Middle East, this is South Asia, and these are the two most Pacific regions in the post-Cold War era. These numbers reflect per capita militarized interstate disputes per country. So what this suggests is that in the Middle East, the average militarized interstate dispute for every country is 8 per the post-Cold War era over about some 30 years. In Western Europe, it's about a half per country. So there's very, very substantial variation across regions in terms of their conflict propensity. This is not an artifact of the post-Cold War world. In fact, for those who dreamt that the post-Cold War era was going to be one where there is the end of history and the triumph of humankind, that's not really happened. This is a further breakdown of the Cold War era versus the post-Cold War era. And if you look at the 13 key major regions in international politics, not much has changed from the Cold War to the post-Cold War era. 3 regions have increased their conflict propensity: Eastern Europe, Central Asia, which didn't actually exist prior to the end of the Cold War, and South Asia, and 2 have decreased. South Africa, Southern Africa, and that's for an obvious reason, apartheid ended. And as a result of apartheid, there was a dramatic change in that region. And East Asia had decreased its conflict propensity, although it's beginning to climb again. So there's a very, very extensive amount of variation across regions in terms of how conflictual they are. And our project has been to try to create a comparative regional analysis, a theoretical framework that would account for these fluctuations and changes over time. Shameless advertisement, we've so far published 4 books on this between 2022 and 2024, and there's a 5th, there's a 5th one. I'm blowing my cover here. How did that not go back? There is a 5th one coming at the end of this year, plus we published a couple of articles of relevance to this. What is our theoretical framework? Bear with me, this is going to take a little bit of time. We're looking at 3 sets of dynamics that could explain why regions vary in terms of their conflict propensity. A primary one is the nature of the region itself. And we've identified 3 sets of dynamics about regions. One is whether or not there's a hierarchy in a region. We found that where there is a dominant power, or maybe 2 dominant powers, that tends to be associated with greater cooperation within the region. And it makes some sense. When you have a dominant power, it can create a deterrent against rogue states or states that want to change the status quo within the region, simply by its overwhelming strength. More importantly, what these dominant states also tend to do in their region is to create institutions or organizations that facilitate cooperation between states. So all else being equal, when there's a hierarchy in the region, there is one or two dominant state, we tend to find much greater cooperation in that region than otherwise, all else being equal. All else, of course, is not equal. So you have some regions, such as South Asia, for example, that has a dominant power, India, and yet a very high level of conflict in the region. That's in part because India is engaged in two major ongoing rivalries, one with Pakistan and one with China, and it limits its ability to create either the deterrence function in the region or the creation of institutions that would accelerate cooperation between states. Sometimes the hierarchy doesn't work because even though the dominant power is dominant, it's dominant relative to the other states in the region. And as it begins to weaken, its ability to impose order in the region gets worse and worse and more difficult. Classic case is Nigeria in Western Africa, which is the dominant power in the region, but it is significantly weakening over time. And its ability to create institutions that are really viable in Western Africa have been minimized. So this isn't necessarily an obvious linkage, but by and large, whether or not there's a hierarchy in the region makes a big difference. Obviously, in the Middle East, there is no dominant power, and therefore we do not expect this relationship in the Middle East. In addition to the hierarchy issue, there are also two other dynamics that go on in regions, we believe. One is that regions vary in terms of pacifying attributes within a region. Some regions have a full range of democratic regimes. Most of our literature indicates that democracies do not fight each other. The larger the constellation of democracies in the region, the more pacific it becomes. This is somewhat also the case with respect to trade interdependencies. The greater the interdependencies in terms of trade within members of a region, again, there tends to be much more cooperation between members of that region. And to the extent that there are viable regional organizations, really effective viable organizations, they tend to help ameliorate major differences in policy preferences between states. So regions that have these kinds of pacifying attributes tend to be much more peaceful than regions that do not. In addition to that, regions carry with them a lot of variation in terms of fault lines. Again, this is an interregional perspective that suggests that in regions where there are very significant rivalries between members of the region, you're going to have a lot of conflict. Incidentally, the Middle East has the densest network of rivalries of any region in post-World War II politics. Similarly, we also know that as territorial disputes increase, conflicts between states increase in regions. Where those territorial disputes have been fundamentally addressed, as in Western Europe, or perhaps North America until the coming of the second Donald Trump administration, those territorial disputes, to the extent that they're minimized, create much more pacific relationships between states in this region. And then thirdly, domestic conflicts have a very negative impact on Pacific relations within regions. Not only do domestic conflicts have an impact on the state, but they also have very important spillover effects in terms of migration patterns and interethnic conflicts across regional boundaries. So we try to assess regions with respect to these three sets of dynamics to try to assess whether or not they're likely to be more cooperative or conflictual. In addition to that, we recognize that regions don't exist in a vacuum. They're part of the larger global international system, and that there are other things that also affect regional dynamics besides what's inside the region itself. One of them is a series of political shocks that may or may not come about. Political shocks have either a positive or negative impact on regional conflicts. What political shocks tend to do is create a window of opportunity for policymakers to rethink their policy direction. And the research that we've conducted shows that in some instances, political shocks have a very negative effect on conflict, and in some instances, political shocks have a very positive effect on conflict. That is reducing the level of conflict that exists. It's also clear that these regions are embedded in larger global political system, and the extent to which that larger global political system engages in a lot of conflict or pacifying relationships, whether or not the system is unipolar or bipolar or multipolar, has implications for how regions respond to interstate conflicts, including the penetration into regions by external powers. Virtually all the work we've done so far indicates that none of this is a positive relationship. As external powers penetrate into a region, they usually exacerbate conflicts and tend to ameliorate them. So this is the larger framework in which we've been working. And it created some good news and some bad news. The good news on our side is that we have some strong theories and substantial cumulative analyses of the causes of conflict, dyadically, monadically, globally. And IR scholars, international politics scholars, have done a fairly good job at this. We also have very high-quality databases to measure conflict patterns in international politics and fluctuations in these conflict patterns over time. And most of this literature is also focused on different levels of analysis in trying to address conflicts, at the monadic, the dyadic, and system level analysis. So this is sort of good news for us. Here's the bad news, and this is what's linked, this is what motivated us to do the project that I'm about to talk about. IR scholars, at least, have very weak theories regarding cooperation. We can talk a lot about conflict. We have a lot of trouble talking about cooperation and what creates durable peace among states. Secondly, we have very limited systematic data to try to measure actual cooperation between states. And then thirdly, and this is my primary concern because of the comparative regional analysis we've done, is that while we do a lot of work at the monadic, dyadic, and system levels, we've done very little work on the regional level analysis. That's not to say that scholars have not focused on a single region, and there's a lot of really good work done on the Middle East, on East Asia, on South America, on Europe, but very little comparative regional analysis across the regions themselves. And so we've decided to spend most of our effort on this type of analysis. This to us is the conflict to peace continuum. This is based on the extent to which states are willing to use coercive instruments versus non-coercive instruments to resolve policy differences between states. What is given is that there are always going to be substantial policy differences between states. That's why we call it politics. The question is, how are you going to resolve those policy differences? And for us, this is the continuum. Some states engage in consistently high coercive instruments to resolve their differences. Some have moved from high to relatively low conflict. Middle East and South Asia here, East Asia, Central Asia, and Eastern Europe are here. Some have attained a level which we call negative peace, which is at least not a lot of conflict, although not very substantial peaceful relationships, which is where we think West Africa and Southern Africa are. And then there is this part, and this is where we have had a lot of trouble. Very little good theorizing about how you get to positive peace, or even this thing called security community, where there is no recognition that members of a region are ever going to go to war with each other, and that they've built coalitions and institutions of high cooperation. Maybe the only truly ongoing true security community is the European Union. And whether or not that's going to last is something for argument. These arrows are meant to indicate that states move easily back and forth between high and low conflict. They move fairly easily between low conflict and negative peace. Once they get to this part, they hardly ever move back here. They move from positive peace maybe to security community or stay at the level of positive peace. If we can figure out why they do so. And that is part of what's driving this. So where have we been going? We've done two things. One is to apply the conflict indicators to regions. Initially, we were trying to go after scholars who said the world is becoming far, far more peaceful than it's ever been. This is a reaction to the Cold Peace, the Cold War era, ranging from Fukuyama to Pinker to Goldstein to Gap, who've been arguing that there's been this progression towards a more peaceful world. Much of the stuff was written before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and several other phenomena. The data seem to suggest that overall we have been moving in a positive direction. But we believe that what they have been wrong about is that they've not disaggregated this data to different regions. And once you do that, you begin to find that this movement towards a positive, peaceful world doesn't really exist. Some regions have been Pacific and have stayed Pacific. Others have fluctuated, as I've indicated earlier. But more importantly, this is where we wanted to go, to create a database of diplomatic cooperative tools for addressing differences in policy preferences between states in different regions of international relations. We call this the RDED project, Regional Diplomatic Events Database. And that's what we've been working on for a very short period of time, a little over a year. This is the project. Initially, we focused on two regions, the Middle East and East Asia. The Middle East because the Middle East is the most conflictual region in international politics, and East Asia because it's an interesting case. Originally, earlier in the post-World War II era, East Asia was at least as conflictual, if not more conflictual, than the Middle East. It then, after the mid to late 1970s, began to enter an era of increasing peaceful relations between its members, and flattened, and then started to increase in conflict once more. So we thought those initial first two regions would pose us some interesting differences in these two different cases. What we've done is to engage in scraping and coding of news reports of high-level bilateral diplomatic activity between states within the region and between the states within the region and outside external powers. We've used a lot of different sources through Newsbank. I don't know if you're familiar with Newsbank. Newsbank aggregates 1,400 different news sources for East Asia. It aggregates 750 different sources for the Middle East, both local sources and global sources. But we've used all of the Newsbank projections for this project. And initially, we started in a time frame of the entire post-Cold War era from 1991 to 2024. One of the things we've discovered is you have to be able to compare trends over time, and that suggests that you have to have consistency in your sources. Your sources are not consistent. Prior to 2000, the coverage for these regions was much more incomplete than after 2000. It has to do with the technology of communication, the technology of news, and as the technology has blossomed after 1999, we found it very, very difficult to assess what was going on from 1991 to 1996. It's just not comparable to the coverage that was created afterwards. So most of this analysis is from 1997 to 2024. We've ended up coding 9,200 separate events between states during that period, some 4,900 diplomatic events for the Middle East, and some 4,200 plus diplomatic events for East Asia. Battery probably died. Let me go to this one. So what I'm about to show you is a very descriptive analysis of the first glance at mostly the Middle East data, because we have not done the more complex analytical work yet. That's why I suggested to you I'm here about 3 months early. These are some of the questions we were trying to address in this first round. Was there an American pivot to Asia, away from the Middle East, as policymakers said there was going to be? Is there an effect of the Arab Spring on cooperative diplomacy in the Middle East? What, if anything, does network analysis reveal regarding regional patterns of cooperation? Have there been changing roles for external major powers and regional powers in the Middle East? What about the role of regional states like Turkey? I'm going to tell you why I care about Turkey in a minute. And then these two, we have not done yet, but we'll be trying to do in the very near future. Pivot from the Middle East to East Asia? Not if you're looking at the diplomatic network. In November of 2011, the Obama administration created a blueprint for pivoting away from the Middle East, moving towards Asia. We want to see whether or not, in reality, its involvement in the diplomatic network in the Middle East had changed and how it had changed. When you do a measure of degree centrality, which is the total number of diplomatic events received and sent in this period, from 1997 to 2024, we bifurcated to the earlier period before the announcement of the pivot, the period after the pivot. And what we find is that, in fact, the American position in the network actually increases, and increases substantially after the so-called pivot towards Asia. Whereas in Asia, there's an increase in the U.S. diplomatic presence, but nowhere near the increase that occurred in the Middle East. If this is one measure of whether or not there was a diplomatic pivot, it doesn't exist. Incidentally, you may or may not recall that one of the things that Putin hates about America is that Obama indicated that Russia stopped being a major power and became a regional power. He may have been absolutely correct. The Russian presence in the Middle East diplomatic network dramatically decreases over time. And by the way, to almost the exact same extent also in East Asia. So our preliminary conclusion here is that for whatever reason, the pivot does not exist. Oops. This is our network, our diplomatic network, over 2 periods of time. This is the initial network that we were able to identify between 1997 and 2002. This is the network, the diplomatic network, and how it looks between 2020 and 2024. This is sort of a Rorschach test. If you're not comfortable with network analysis, you can read anything in here that you want to read in here. What we read in here is that there have been a couple of significant changes over time in terms of the key players in the Middle East. The Iranian role, both in terms of its centrality and what we call between the centrality, which is its ability to broker relationships within the Middle East, has decreased, along with Egypt. The United States is relatively an outlier here. In the early periods, Syria is very active. This is an entirely different pattern, with Turkey becoming much more active, Iran is declining, and so on. Let me try to disaggregate this a bit for you. Keep going the other way. It turns out that we have 2 sets of states. One group that is decreasing its potential diplomatic clout, and one group that's increasing its potential diplomatic clout. Egypt, Iran, Jordan, and Syria, for some very obvious reasons, have significantly decreased their centrality in the diplomatic network. On the other hand, the Gulf states and Turkey have dramatically increased their centrality in the diplomatic network between 1997 and 2024. I could have made this even worse by also adding Kuwait, Oman, Bahrain. Their patterns are not as dramatic, but they have also been increasing their diplomatic clout in the network. Why is that? I've sure you can explain that much, much better than I, but we're going to be doing some of that analysis. We also looked at brokerage influence, that is the ability to mediate between different clusters within the network. And these are the brokerage scores for these states that have been dramatically declining, not only in terms of their centrality, but also their ability to broker between these different subclusters in the Middle East. And the pattern is fairly similar in terms of the number of states, but dramatic in terms of even greater decline in brokerage capability than in central influence capability. And again, the ones that have significantly increased their brokerage capabilities are very similar Gulf states plus Turkey. And you'll notice the UAE, which didn't even exist in terms of brokerage influence in 1997, now dramatically increasing its brokerage capability in 2024. What else can we show you here? Oops. Why is this not working? This is a quick shot at how cohesive this diplomatic network is. And network analysis looks at the ratio of actual connections and ties between states versus the potential number of ties between states. At some point, there's a threshold where you have very well integrated network. It's about here. That means that 80% of the potential ties actually exist. This is where the Middle East is. And while there was initially an increase towards that threshold, it has been declining since, which is not necessarily really good news for diplomatic non-coercive instruments for these states. What has been the effect of the Arab Spring? Well, we have no idea what was the effect of the Arab Spring, to be absolutely honest with you. But here are a couple of interesting, quick insights. One is that in the 5-year period after the Arab Spring, states in the Middle East dramatically reduced their diplomatic interactions with each other. They did not increase them at all. But the pattern, again, is bifurcated. Some states did substantially increase their interactions with each other. Those are primarily the Gulf states and Turkey. The other states, almost all other states, had significantly reduced their interactions. What can we read into this? There's an enormous amount of noise surrounding the Arab Spring, right? There are all kinds of other conflicts that are going on, and while I don't necessarily want to attribute this to the Arab Spring alone, there seems to have been some effect on diplomatic exchanges, as we can look at the networks themselves. Again, changing roles of outside powers in the Middle East. As I indicated, U.S. centrality has actually increased. So did British centrality. Not nearly as much as the United States, but there's been some significant increase in the part of the role that the United Kingdom has played in this diplomatic network. The other major powers of international politics, their centrality has dramatically decreased. Those are not the only players in the Middle East, as you know. There are all kinds of other regional powers outside of the Middle East that play in the Middle East. Of those, India has increased its centrality. It was a surprise to us, partly because maybe I don't know anything about the Middle East. But the Indians have very significant commercial interests in the Middle East, and there's a huge Indian diaspora in the Middle East. And the Indians have been fairly active there. The Germans, who had aspirations for major power status in the early 1990s and pursued that major power status, actually were very active in the 1990s, early 2000s in the Middle East, and then dramatically reduced their involvement afterwards as they began to think of themselves more as a regional power in Europe rather than a global major power. The other regional powers that have aspirations to major power status at some time in the future have played a very negligible role, at least. And the extent to which the BRICS have become major players across regions of international politics, we don't find that here in the Middle East, nor do we find it in East Asia. Let's see. Sorry, I'm flitting around here. We also also asked the question, can major powers be honest brokers in movies? That is, do they have the brokerage capacity, the links to these disparate groupings in movies, to be able to broker relationships between these groupings of states? And the answer doesn't appear to be yes. This is an assessment of their brokerage capacity based on what's the average brokerage capacity amongst states within a region. This represents 40% less, only 40% of the average of states in the region. So the United States, which demonstrates fairly high percentage here, is less than half of what the average is for regional states. The Russians are far below that. The Chinese, which had a fair amount of regional capacity for brokering in the early period, 1997 to 2002, virtually disappeared, despite issues about whether or not the Chinese have been active between Saudi Arabia and Iran. So it doesn't look like the external major powers are able to play much of a brokerage role. And then I wanted to just, for a second, talk about Turkey's re-engagement with the Middle East. And if you'll pardon me, I'll tell you a quick story. I was a NATO fellow in Brussels in the early 2000s. I, along with two other people, met with the Turkish ambassador, who was ambassador to both NATO and the EU, and we asked them, "You guys ever going to get into the European Union?" And they started negotiations on accession in 1987. There was some formal agreements started in 1994. Nothing's really happened. And he said to us, "You want to know how we get into the EU? Why don't you go to this meeting of an EU subcommittee on transportation, and you'll get the answer. And you come back and talk to me." And we went over to see the subcommittee in action. There were 8 countries represented. They sat around the table. They were talking about incredibly mundane transportation issues. And about an hour into this, the French representative held up a finger, and the doors flew open, and 2 Turkish guys came in carrying coffee. I got the point. That's the only way they were going to get into the EU. We went back to him and said, "Does that mean that you guys are not going to get into the EU?" And he said, "Why do you think I'm ambassador to NATO?" He says, "Look at my face. I'm 3 shades lighter than you are," pointing at me. He says, "I'm acceptable." He says, "We're never going to get into the EU. It's time for us to go home." I said, "Go home?" He says, "Yeah, it's time for us to go back to the Middle East." And this tends to show that pattern. This is 97 to 2002. By 2020, 2024, there's been a 67% increase in Turkish centrality in the Middle East now. It's between the centrality increased by almost 100%. Turks came home. And they didn't come home just diplomatically, as you know. They also came home in a variety of different other ways, including very coercive instruments. But they returned and did not stay in Europe. I want to very quickly show you this. We ran initial correlations between degree centrality and the military and economic capacity of states. Something's changed. In the early period, the correlation between degree centrality and a country's military capacity was very low. By 2015 to 2024, it was substantial. Economic capacity was always important. Right? But even when you look at this part, combine those 2 measures, which are measures of realist assessments of what drives countries and what makes success for countries. The combined effect of those 2 variables to measure degrees centrality only explains 24% of the variation in how these networks are operating, which means that over 75% of the variation remains unexplained by realist theories of international politics. There's a lot of other stuff going on, as you all probably know far better than I do. So, where are we going now? These are the next steps. So we need to do some serious analysis. The first question is, what actually accounts for these changes within the networks? Because military and economic capacities are insufficient explanations. We want to explore the effects of regime change and domestic conflicts on diplomatic interactions. We want to explore the effects of political shocks on the diplomatic network. And we want to explore the effects of changing rivalries in the diplomatic network, because as dense as the network of rivalries in the Middle East is, it is changing. Secondly, we want to compare network patterns in the Middle East and East Asia, in significant part because East Asia does have a dominant power. And the extent to which it then drives the network is likely to be very, very different. We're also finding some similarities. For example, Turkey's rise is very similar to Vietnam's rise in the East Asian network. And the data were very, very similar to those two countries. And then we need to link these patterns of cooperation, but also patterns of conflict, because sometimes the cooperation patterns are in response to conflict, sometimes they are separate from the conflict patterns. And then our second stage is then to try to expand all of this. We've been doing this on a shoestring. Thank you for the shoestring, but we've been doing it on a shoestring, and now we need to expand it. And so we're applying for a UA Challenge grant in one more day. And also looking at the European Research Consortium and Carnegie to be able to expand this by training computer software rather than us hand coding, and then to expand the analysis to 12 other regions of international politics. If we were to do this by hand, it would take us about 18 years to do. I'm not going to be around by then. And then also to try to apply this analysis to how status as it gets attributed by states to other states, because some of these measures are really measures of status attribution. And we are convinced of that. So that's the project. That's where we are right now. I want to thank you again for helping us do this. And thank you for your time. I'd be happy to answer any questions. If you have any critical questions, I'm pleased to answer them. If you have crazy questions, I'll try to answer them. Thank you.
We have around 15 minutes for questions. Gabriel, you want to?
Yeah, I have two questions. My first is RDRD, my understanding is it's solely focused on conflict between states or across state lines, right? Does it not consider sort of internal conflict with the states?
Right.
Okay.
Both on the conflict side and on the cooperation side, we're looking at relationships between states, not within states.
Gotcha.
Although our framework suggests that conflicts within states are also going to have an impact on the region itself.
Gotcha. Okay. And then my second question was about the sort of the theory framework chart that you have. It's particularly the democratic section. I'm not arguing the democratic piece, but what I think is interesting about it is I wonder, does it take into fact like democratic transition as sort of an element of peace? When we say democracy brings peace, does that also consider the democratic transition and sort of turbulence that comes with that? Because the states that you have that show like as the main diplomatic powers in the Middle East, like Qatar and Saudi Arabia and Bahrain, are not traditionally talked about for their democratic qualities. So I was kind of interested in like how that plays into that sort of aspect of the theory.
Yeah, I tried to cram in 4 hours and 25 minutes.
Yeah.
But you're absolutely correct. The transitioning to democracy is a very, very dangerous time for most states. And there tends to be a U-shaped relationship between regime type and conflict. So very authoritarian states sometimes avoid war altogether. Very mature democracies avoid war with each other. Transitioning democracies tend to engage in a lot of conflict with both democracies and with relatively authoritarian regimes. So that mix of democracy and non-democracy in regions is really about more maturing democracy. Maturing is not a good adjective for this. In a ranking between 0 and 10, if 10 is the highest level of democracy and 0 is the highest level of authoritarianism. We're really talking about countries that have achieved an 8 or above, that do not go to war or engage in major conflict with others with an 8 or above. Incidentally, the latest measure of democracy shows the United States at 7.5. We've broken the barrier above. I don't know if that means that we're going to go to war with Canada, but if I were the Canadians, I'd be getting nervous.
Yes, you go ahead.
So, I don't think you're gonna like this question. But, because it's historical and refers to the period before you're covering. But I was wondering if how your model could account for that. So with Western Europe, that was the most conflictual region that has ever existed right before the Cold War. And now is the security, like the most peaceful. So how does your model, can it account for that, or is it not designed to go before the Cold War, or the factors were completely?
Ultimately, it should be able to account for that. Here's the model, and here's how I would argue it post hoc. You're absolutely right. Prior to World War II, if you look at the last 400 years of history in international politics, there was no region that was more conflictual than Europe. So what happened? I think two dynamics really happened. One is that conflicts created a drain on those states in part, and huge political shocks. World War I was a major shock. If you read the stuff just immediately prior to World War I, most scholars did not ever expect World War II to occur. It became a huge impact. And then secondarily, World War II had an even greater effect. So in this part, the political shock part, I think altered a variety of regional characteristics.
So is that then the best way to achieve peace and security? Have massive shocks in World War III?
Well, you know, in most of the work we've done on foreign policy, the best predictor of what China does today is what China did yesterday. And if you put a lag in behavior with the previous year or 2 years ago, it is the best predictor of what you're going to do today across virtually every country in the world. What breaks that? Political shock is what breaks it. All of a sudden, policymakers are shocked into beginning to rethink their foreign policy, also their domestic policies. That doesn't guarantee you peace or anything else. It doesn't even guarantee you change. There have to be a lot of other things going on at the same time, including the creation of the allowance for policy entrepreneurs who then begin to agitate for different kinds of policies. And under conditions of enormous uncertainty and political shock, you may begin to rethink this. My French friends used to tell me in Paris that they really always hated the Germans. Now they've learned to hate the Brits and stop hating the Germans. And this created a whole sea change on the continent. Why? Because they broke Germany. And the political shock of trying to figure out now how to deal with this led them onto an entirely different path of extensive cooperation with the Germans. So the shocks changed, the fault lines changed. I don't want to overplay this, but there was an imposition of a new set of orders by the United States into Europe as well. And in this instance, this intrusion of external penetration by the United States actually led to some positive things. The rivalries were minimized, the territorial disputes were eliminated, and they agreed to create viable regional organizations that allowed for much more peaceful relationships, developed substantial trade dependencies, and most of these countries became democratic. So the whole nature of the region got transformed. This is not good news that you and I are talking about, because hopefully you don't need another world war to change the Middle East or East Asia or two of the most conflictual regions in the world, which are Central and East Africa. You can get there other ways. If you and I were talking to Latin American scholars, they would tell you there's a different path. The Latin Americans didn't have a world war, not to the extent that the Europeans did, yet South America is a relatively Pacific region. So you can get there incrementally as well. But Europe gives a really good example of how things can change in a fairly dynamic manner under very difficult circumstances. I thought you were going to tell me that I was all along. Thank you. Anybody else want to tell me how I'm completely wrong? Was there any surprise that
Also, apologies, I have very little poli-sci background, so forgive me if this is a simplistic question. But like, how reliable of a predictor is a framework like this, considering that some of the previously like strongest brokers that you listed, like the UK and the US, are now leaning more into drastic isolationist policies in the past like 4 to 8 years? Like, how reliable is a predictor that something that's historically been stable in Pacific is now all of a sudden erratically shifting into a different direction?
You're talking about the roles that external powers are willing to play
Yeah.
in regions. We don't assume that that's a constant. We assume that that's a variable, and it's going to vary given the nature of great power interests in the global system, and it's obviously going to vary with the nature of who's in power and what those interests are and the people coming into power. None of you have asked me a question about Donald Trump. Thank you very much.
We try to avoid that.
So do I. It's difficult to guess here what the hell is going to be really going on here with respect to this, whether or not we're talking about performance art or we're talking about actual policy. You and I could probably make a much better assessment of that in another year. But what is clear is what you're saying is policies can change. Global leaders can pull back. Historically, IR scholars have always talked about the global liberal world order controlled by the United States and propped up by the United States. Those scholars today are bashing their heads against the wall saying the most radical power in international politics right now appears to be the United States, seeking to destroy the global orders. Yeah. Does this explain that? No, it does not. But that's an entirely different question.
This is a simple question. On your slide 13, you had your network analysis. Was that R or DEFI? Were you using R, the programming software?
We're using R.
I use R. Okay, I was just curious. We use R.
So we did network analysis.
Yes. Thank you, Thomas. Very interesting. Now let's get back to BRICS, because
BRICS.
BRICS is interesting. How do you see BRICS? So BRICS, as we know, is controlling now, I think, a big portion of world economy and a big portion of the world population. How do you see BRICS in 5 years from now? Russia has been trying hard, also China, to get this group together to come up with a new world order. Do you think BRICS going to succeed? Is it expected to change the world order and the centrality of powers in the way we know it today?
I used to think that BRICS was a figment of Wall Street's imagination, because these guys created the concept of BRICS.
Yeah.
Then I started thinking that this is more serious, but beneath the label are hiding a variety of different interests and capabilities. So we're talking about Brazil, Russia, India,
China,
China, and South Africa.
Yeah.
The Indians are in big doo-doo. The Brazilians and the Indians decided to make a major push to become a major power, and they picked on sub-Saharan Africa first. They were going to expand their relationships with all sub-Saharan African countries and demonstrate their ability to become a major power, and realized they had none of the diplomatic capabilities to do so. the size of the Indian diplomatic corps is smaller than that of Singapore. Singapore is a tiny little city-state. The size of the Brazilian diplomatic corps is smaller than India's. And they virtually bankrupted themselves going after this target in sub-Saharan Africa. What did they do? They withdrew, established minimal relationships with the African Union, and then went home. They don't have the capability, I don't think, and the interest, although the Indians have now started to recoup. And they are very aggressively now involved in East Asia and South Asia. And I think their prospects of having influence are far greater now than it has been before. The Brazilians, not so much. The South Africans do not have the capability of playing this global role, except in multilateral institutions, which leaves us with the Russians and the Chinese. The Russians have done an enormous amount of damage to themselves with this invasion of Ukraine. It has been incredibly expensive. And some people estimate they've lost over 200,000 soldiers in Ukraine. Their economy is in tatters, despite what the official statistics indicate. Chinese are better positioned, but their economy is in significant trouble. I'm one of those people who are correct once every 24 hours or once every 12 hours. I have been predicting the disintegration of China for 20 years. I may be correct in the next 20 years. I think the Chinese are in very, very serious trouble domestically. So I don't think it's going to happen this way. I think what may change the world may be the insanities that we're seeing in Washington, D.C. To me, the predominant power in global affairs is still the United States. Its military capabilities are vastly superior to number two, whoever number two you want to have. Its economic capabilities are substantially greater than China's. And we're doing a really great job of harming ourselves and the rest of the world. So I'm far more worried about the United States than I am interested in the BRICS themselves. What I think is also the case is that they've not been able to coalesce very well. Symbolically, they have. In terms of actual policies, they've not been able to coordinate very well.
You say?
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm sorry I was late. So you talked about the theoretical framework. If you could just talk a little bit about methodology. I'm a big fan of social network analysis myself. So if you can just talk about how you use that in this research.
Well,
and why was it useful in a sense to tease out some of these the degree of centrality?
I'm in a minority here, and if I was talking in front of a group of sociologists, they would kill me for saying this. The way I see network analysis is that it's a cute, handy tool for description, not for causal analysis, but for description. And what it does is create a pretty good description of how states relate to each other over a period of time. Degree centrality allows us to look at how central they are, coming and going, me sending you exchanges, you sending me exchanges. Eigenvector network analysis is something very, very similar, with places of higher value in some exchanges rather than others. In-degree centrality shows you whether or not I'm getting a lot of stuff versus out-degree centrality, whether or not you're getting a lot of stuff. And we can see whether or not the network is getting stronger or weaker. Everything I've just said is description. It's fancy description, it's cute description.
It's a visual.
Pardon?
It's a visual.
But it is visual and it's spatial.
Yeah.
That's exactly right. And then those two Rorschach pictures I showed you, we could spend hours saying how cool that is. Some will see an elephant, some will see a donkey.
So, sorry, I hope I'm not. So I want to ask about the focus on regions. This may be odd coming from people in the Middle East Studies Department, but how do you know that the Middle East is the relevant unit here? I mean, maybe it would be like the Gulf, for example, like a smaller unit. Or, so what are the criteria for determining what should be the constitutional region?
Bless you for asking me this question, because we spent a year and a half of our lives trying to address this issue. Because we don't think that a region is an objective reality. We believe that a region is something that is created by states within limits. So the way we have identified regions is a two-way process. One is, do states have the capacity within a certain geographical area of reaching each other? Do they have the economic capacity and the military capacity to reach each other? More so than they can reach others. And then the second one is, do they interact with each other more so than they interact with others? And on the basis of those two dimensions, we were able to isolate 14 different regions. Not all the countries in international politics. For example, we do not have a Caribbean region because they don't have the capacity to reach each other, and they don't interact very much with each other. We don't have a Central American region because most Central American states either lack the capability to interact with each other, or they're interacting with North America or South America. So we don't have a Central American region. But it is true that states can move from one region to another. And the reason why I'm fascinated with Turkey is because if we were talking about the world of the early 1980s, Turkey would have fit into Europe and not into the Middle East. It's not that its capabilities changed dramatically, but its interest changed. So it's primarily interacting with the Europeans, and then starting in the 1990s, given what the ambassador said, it started interacting with the Middle East. So it's on the basis of those two. I was invited to a meeting of the Mediterranean Studies Association. And we went in and said to them, you know, you guys are working on a project that doesn't exist. And they said, what do you mean? I said, well, there is no Mediterranean region. There are 4 regions around the Mediterranean, and they're all relatively clustered together, but they don't have one region in common. And we're able to show the evidence. Turns out that these Mediterranean scholars are almost all French. And they said to us, no, you don't understand. We imagine a Mediterranean region, and we don't care what your data show. We imagine a Mediterranean region. And then they were kind enough to treat us to dinner. I understand the cultural issues and the cultural dimensions around regions, and I also understand the sub-regional issue, which I think you're pointing to, which is very, very important. There is a region in the Middle East, we believe. There's also sub-regions. There's the Gulf. There's something else. By the way, in our regional clustering, the Maghreb does not fit in the Middle East. It stands alone. And most of its interactions is with Europe and sub-Saharan Africa, not with the Middle East. So whereas a lot of scholars clump that into the Middle East, we do not. We treat it separately. But it's based on those two dimensions. Unfortunately, the clustering changes over time. So if you look at what these regions, what the membership of these regions is in 2000s, it is different than what it was in the 1950s, right? Because their interests have changed and their interactions have changed. People who point to cultural issues or postmodernist arguments about regions think that this is too objective a measurement. But we think that behind those interactions, those are reimaginings by policymakers of who they are and where they belong. It's an act by the Turks to say, we now belong in the Middle East. It's an identity issue for them. We don't care what drives it, whether it's an identity issue or something else. We just want to see where they cluster.
Just on the Turk point, the Turks have been active in the Middle East for hundreds of years.
Absolutely, yeah. And I would say that if we were looking at the Middle East in the 19th century or the 18th or 17th, they were squarely in the middle. In fact, they may have been the dominant power in the Middle East. Don't doubt it at all. It's just recently there's been movement towards Europe and then back away from Europe. absolutely. And that underlines my notion of what a region is. Regions change. Regions change in composition. We believe that there's an East Asian region, but there are two sub-regions in East Asia. There's an East Asian region and a Southeast Asian region. And they used to be separate. Their interactions now are interwoven a fair amount, probably because of the dominance of China now in the East Asian processes.
On your earlier point about BRICS in sub-Saharan Africa and diplomatic interactions and India and Brazil divesting. So I think at that point there was an intense competition and China won the battle because they had the resources. It just experientially, most of the infrastructure development in sub-Saharan Africa and countries like Ethiopia has been primarily Chinese technology.
That's good. That's good.
So, and that's happening across North Africa. And I don't think India or Brazil could compete or invest on those long horizons at that level.
You're absolutely correct.
And so they lost, right? Yeah.
They lost on the economic dimension.
That's right.
What I was trying to suggest is that they were pursuing more aggressive relations on the diplomatic dimension. And they couldn't do that either, but they tried.
That's right.
Yes, sir.
Just a basic building block kind of question. How do you define diplomatic events?
Okay, great question. We identified 4 kinds of events. And these are meant to be high-level bilateral events. So it's head of state to head of state, or head of government to head of state, constitutes one level. Cabinet level ministers with decision-making authority to head of state is another level. A third level is cabinet level ministers to cabinet level ministers is the third level. And then we've got 2 other levels where representatives of governments, they're sort of envoys to heads of state or to less than heads of state as 4th and 5th levels. And then we can create a value score on all of these. Anything below that are actual different working kind of relationships. And what we want to separate is the more symbolic relationships away from the assistant deputy secretary communicating with the assistant deputy secretary on something important.
So these are public interactions, telephone visits,
They're physical visits.
physical visits.
We don't have access to the other stuff. So unless a newspaper reports that the King of Jordan visited the King of Saudi Arabia, we can't report it because we don't have access. But these have to be public reports, and we're biased because of the public report. Hopefully, we pick up enough of this consistently over time. We're beginning to validate all of this by tracking their official sources. The Chinese have official sources, the Japanese have official sources. The United States has all visits of the President of the United States and the Secretaries of Defense and Secretaries of State. We're trying to see if the official sources are also replicating what we found, and the correlations are like 0.99. It's hard to miss the big ones, right?
But it's also hard to evaluate the relevance of each visit.
Right. Any specific visit is very, very difficult to see how relevant that was. And that's where we're looking at overall patterns. So if there are consistently a series of visits to Turkey over time, rather than just one visit, by head of state to head of state, that's when we're going to say, hey, something.
Any more questions?
You've been very kind. We got 20 minutes left before the game starts. And I want to thank you all again for